there are broadly three paths that Indian Americans and other high-achieving minority groups can take. And I want to go through them and talk about the advantages and disadvantages, and then offer my own view on what needs to be done here. So one strategy, of course, is assimilation, and assimilation basically means that you over time, as you get further and further from the immigrant experience, you basically assimilate, absorb yourself into American culture, American society, and this is maybe like a manifestation of the traditional melting pot ideal. Now, the advantage, obviously, of assimilation is that when you're assimilated and you're basically no different from everyone else, that dampens the impetus for discrimination. The problem and the trouble, though, is that what assimilation would basically mean is taking this minority group that has just produced an enormous amount of wealth and clout, is just on such a positive trajectory, and basically assimilating into a culture that's going in the opposite direction. And what assimilation would basically mean is taking all these attributes of Indian Americans and other high achieving minority groups, taking all the things that make them different, and basically now foregoing these advantages or giving them up. This is, and one of the books that I would urge you to think about, if you're interested in this, is a recent book by Amy Chua and her husband, Jed Rubenfeld. They're both professors at Yale Law School. They wrote a book called The Triple Package, where they basically look at this question of why, they basically try to account or propose a theory for why certain ethnic groups tend to overperform in America and others don't. And one of the things that they found is that basically, they identify a triple package. And one of the things that they find, which is an uncomfortable conclusion they reach, is that a big part of the reason why these minority groups do so well is because they have a private ethos that they often don't talk about publicly, but that is actually in marked contrast to the kind of ideals that mainstream society tries to inculcate. So like one of the examples that they bring up is a superiority complex. So in a culture where we're all taught to be equal, think of everyone as equal, etc., when you look at these high achieving minority groups, they have a very profound superiority complex. So where basically they tell themselves that they're better than others. So like Chinese Americans have this sort of civilizational view where China is the center of the universe. Jews obviously regard themselves as the chosen people. And one of the things that Chua and Rubenfeld argue is responsible for Indian American success is that they basically bring together all these this chip that they have, whether from the caste system or whatever. So like if they're Brahmins, they bring the superiority to the U.S. or you see it in Gujarati Americans, Gujaratis in the Indian American community. They're very proud of their entrepreneurial, business-like culture and tradition, and so they sort of think that they have an advantage. And whether or not these things are true or not, I mean, they're often mixed up with different mythologies. This belief in superiority, that you're like a better group, that you're and superior, can become a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the belief leads in fact to greater achievement or outcomes. I think this is particularly complicated, the assimilation path too, because the ultimate in assimilation obviously is interracial marriage. And when you just look at what the realities are of certain Asian groups and so forth trying to embark on this path where they're encouraging interracial marriage, this isn't necessarily going to put Asian Americans at especially Asian American males at an advantage in these markets. And you're seeing that with Jewish Americans who have, to a large degree, taken a assimilation path. When you look at the high degrees of outgroup marriage among Jewish Americans relative to their European counterparts, I think that over time this is going to erode a lot of the advantages the Jewish American community has built up for itself. you actually, in a way, you see this assimilation strategy playing out with the decline of the Episcopalian establishment in America. And we don't really talk about it in this way, but with the Episcopalian establishment in America, what you really had was this very small kind of religious, kind of ethnic social group that was really at the pinnacle of American society. And within a very short period of time in the 20th century, they basically lost it all. And when you look at like IQ distributions in the U.S., Episcopalian IQs, they're at the very top with Indians and Jews. But when you look at actually the output or the power or the influence of Episcopalians in America, it just isn't really there anymore. And I think a big part of that was a choice that Episcopalians made, basically to renounce some of this self-confident WASP culture and assimilate more into mainstream society. So this would be my critique of the assimilation model. The second model would be a more status quo model, which has allowed high-achieving minority groups to basically come to the fore. And that is basically, it's a strategy where it's more of like a mixed salad, to use the metaphor, where basically they partake in American society, they compete in mainstream American institutions, but they do so by preserving many of their own traditions and attributes. And so, for example, if you look at, Mormons are probably like the longest standing model of this, where basically they go to business school, they compete in different enterprises, they engage in politics, but they also have a very insular and unique community with different traditions, different privileges for the group. And then they basically kind of balance a certain tightrope where they preserve their own identity. They, for example, strongly discourage out-group marriage and other things, but they also, at the end of the day, aren't just going into isolation. They're competing in mainstream society. Now, I would offer, this is obviously a model that in some ways accounts for why high-achieving minority groups have become that in the first place. But the problem with it, as I talked about in the beginning of this talk, is that depends. First of all, it's hard to maintain. I mean, when you're living in a multi-ethnic, multicultural society with greater and greater opportunities for mobility and whatever, it just becomes harder to enforce a lot of these norms and cohesion. But two, even if you can figure out a way to do it, as Mormons, for example, have done, the problem, as I talk about, is that this also applies to some degree a certain baseline level of tolerance or acquiescence by the dominant group in American society. And while the trend line has broadly favored acceptance and inclusion and tolerance over the course of the 20th century, if my argument is correct, we're probably at the beginning of a backlash where a lot of this cosmopolitanism, these norms are going in the other direction. Often when you bring up these historic examples of that I talked about earlier in the talk, like the Chinese in Southeast Asia or the Jews in Europe or whatever, people sort of tune out because they think it's alarmist and they think that it can't happen here. And I'm not predicting mass atrocities or anything like that. I think American society has a certain foundation and culture and tradition that probably makes us immune from that. But one of the realities to look at is that when you do see these major atrocities or backlashes happening against high-achieving minority groups, they often happen very, very quickly in a short, unexpected period of time. And it doesn't take much to really bring out the latent ugliness in us. I think one of the best examples here is in Southeast Asia, where you look at what happened in the 97 Asian financial crisis, where there were these longstanding tensions, but with this economic pressure, like almost overnight, you just see an outburst of this, and so one has to think about with this strategy, what happens if we have another financial crisis? What if the '08 financial crisis had happened and there wasn't a bailout or something to sort of tamp over the edges? I mean, how would this have shaken out? My prediction is probably not particularly well for certain ethnic groups. So this brings up a third option, and this is the one that I'm going to endorse and make an argument for, which is that high achieving minority groups ought to reconceptualize their own identity and embark on a different strategy that is more cosmopolitan, more globalist in nature, and that basically does not, to the same degree, peg its fortunes to the United States, and really diversifies its portfolio and tries to perpetuate its advantage in different ways. Now, I would argue that there should be broadly three elements of this kind of a plan or strategy. Um, I think number one, it begins internally, and I think one of the big uh, contributions of a lot of the self-help or self-development literature is basically that any kind of change that we want to manifest in the world ultimately comes from within, comes from our own beliefs, the terms and words that we use, the way we think of ourselves. And I think right now, one of the things that high achieving minority groups have in common is that they all view themselves as being, at the end of the day, Americans. And they view themselves as being part of the history and traditions of American culture. They feel, whatever ties they might have to other countries, they ultimately feel like they're more accepted in this culture. And that's why you see among immigrant groups that they often are able to perform at such a high level too, is because they have a very unironic sense of patriotism. A lot of the cynicism that you might see from native foreign populations doesn't set in when they realize that they can come here and be judged on the merits, judged on their skill. But what I would argue is that it may be time to have a more cosmopolitan view where we recognize that actually, whether it's Indian Americans or Asian Americans or whatever group we're talking about, that while we've had a good run in the US, we're not at the end of the day American, but we're a unique group that's different, that's insular, and that can really replicate and grow its advantages anywhere in the world, whether or not trends in the US are in their favor. And so this might mean a more transactional relationship with American society in favor of a more globalist approach where we're laying down different roots, different connections, more of an interest in other countries around the world. And just thinking about this in terms of our own identity and how we view the world, that I think just making this mental shift is going to produce a cascade of other insights. The second I would say is in the realm of investments and financial management. And one of the things that can, when you look at how these atrocities have shaken out in other societies, well before it leads to any kind of killing or mass reprisals, one of the first things that majority or majoritarian societies will do is basically seize the assets of these high achieving minority groups. Now, I talked earlier in this talk about how I think that's already happening with progressive taxation and regulation and so forth, which is basically a genteel way of using the power of the state to take from certain groups and whatnot. But much of the wealth in American society that these high achieving minority groups have are in the form of assets that could very easily be confiscated. I think real estate is a very obvious example, but even when you think about bank accounts, different forms of property, they're all the only thing really preventing these sort of resources or whatever from being confiscated is an American legal judicial system that offers the right checks and balances. But the reality is, in a majoritarian society with certain public policy norms, the American system is not necessarily one that you want to bet on. And I think this is why I've become more interested in things like gaining multiple passports, opening offshore bank accounts, acquiring many different citizenships, and just generally diversifying. Another thing here that could be done is pursuing occupations or pursuing ways of gaining wealth that are more location independent rather than location dependent. So, for example, if you work in that might mean, for example, investing in a service business that you can pack up and locate somewhere else that isn't necessarily tied to being in a particular location or area. And then obviously when you have a location independent income streams, that also gives you the liberty to diversify globally, form new networks, new connections, and basically now move around to different parts of the world. And as with the US, take a more transactional approach to other countries. If they offer a rule of law and a favorable business climate and culture of tolerance, you go there and you take advantage of it, but you're also prepared and ready to leave whenever you need to, whenever trends start to go the other way. And all the things have believing that they're a unique entrepreneurial, liberal, capitalist society. I mean, the reality is that there are any number of ways to diversify around the world, as I've talked about before, where you can take advantage of global arbitrage, you can take advantage of favorable tax havens, where you can have much more individual freedom and autonomy. And then the final, by the way, just one point here, and I had done a earlier video. I was talking to a friend of mine, David Lesbrons, who's one of these lawyers, advisors who helps people basically globalize their finances and move offshore and whatever. And he was saying that I was asking him, where do your clients come from? Like, who are the people who really get it? And he was saying a lot of them actually come from, they come from all over the world, but a lot of them come from groups or nationalities or ethnicities where they've already been through this process before, where they've already had the experience of having their businesses or whatever confiscated by some tragedy. And actually, we talked about the Chinese and Southeast Asia. Another group actually is when you look at Indians who lived through partition with the collapse of the British Empire. A lot of these groups had a lot of their wealth confiscated in the course of partition, and they now intuitively understand that you have to mitigate some political risk here.